Hey friends, this is Pastor Joe at Southwest Lutheran Church in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and this is the third of 5 videos on abusive relationships. And before we get started, a quick safety note: please make sure that you're watching this video in a safe place, and if you feel physically threatened at all, please call 911, get emergency services to help make sure that you are physically safe. So, what is our video now? It is what is going on inside an abusive relationship. What is that abusive relationship dynamic, and what does Scripture have to say about it? To get at this, first let's think about what's going on inside the mind of an abuser. Now, people who do the abusing in an abusive relationship typically understand that they are doing something hurtful by using coercion to control their partner. But what they do is they justify in their own minds their use of coercion, whether that's violence, emotional manipulation, intimidation, or something else. But they justify their own use of coercion to control their partner. They have in their mind a certain ideal for how their partner should be, or a certain ideal for what their relationship would look like. And even though they understand they're not doing the right thing by being violent or by exercising coercive control in some way, it's kind of an ends justify the means thing. They convince themselves that their spouse is better off being controlled than their spouse is in making their own decisions. So they justify their actions because they believe they deserve to control the other. They know better, they believe. For example, you might think of, say, a jealous boyfriend who has convinced himself, right? He knows his girlfriend needs to be faithful to him. And in his mind, other men are a threat. And so he retaliates against his girlfriend every time she speaks to another man, no matter the context. That's coercion. That's control. But in his mind, he's helping her stay faithful by punishing her whenever she is speaking to another man, right? It's that kind of mistaken thinking that goes into being an abuser. The key thing is that abusers believe fundamentally they have made a moral decision. They are entitled to exercise control, and they are entitled to enforce their control over their partner through violence, intimidation, emotional manipulation, and other means. But what we're going to see today is that the Bible does not permit us to exercise that kind of control over another person. And the Bible envisions our intimate relationships as a meeting of equals. Two equal people who are equally free to engage in the relationship, and two equal people who are also equally free to end the relationship. Now, when we say intimate relationships here, let me clarify, we mean any sort of close relationship. So this could be marriage, it could mean dating, it could mean engagement, or even a close friendship or something like that. Any sort of close relationship there is an intimate relationship. It doesn't necessarily mean sexually intimate, although of course that's appropriate in marriage, and that's good in marriage. So any sort of intimate relationship has the possibility for abuse. But what does the Bible say about this sort of thinking, where one person believes they have the right to exercise control and to enforce control over another? What we're going to see is the Bible does not say that's okay. That is not how intimate relationships are supposed to go. And to see this, we're going to go to Ephesians chapter 5 and chapter 6. Ephesians verse 22 through Ephesians chapter 6 verse 9. And I want to start out by saying that this passage is about household relationships. The Apostle Paul is teaching the proper form of household relationships for Christians. And so he talks about the relationship between spouses, husbands and wives. He talks about the relationship between parents and children, and also the relationship between masters and slaves, which was a common household relationship in that day. This is not saying the Bible approves of slavery. It does not, but it does regulate slavery so that it doesn't cause any more harm than it has to. So, what does it say? Well, this is verse 22. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. And a few verses later, verse 25, the apostle says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I want to start by pointing out, if you take these verses out of context, you can very much use them to support abusive relationships. Because after all, verse 22, wives, submit to your husbands. And if you took that out of context as a husband and said, wife, you're not submitting to me, therefore you're sinful and you're doing it wrong, that would be spiritual coercion. Or wives, looking at verse 25, saying, husbands, give yourself up for me, just as Christ gave himself up for the church. Sacrifice everything you have for me. And if you don't sacrifice everything you have and your own desires and passions and own decisions for me, then you're doing something wrong, you're sinning, and you're not being a good husband. That would be another kind of spiritual coercion and control, right? But you can only do that if you take these out of context, because the whole theme of the passage doesn't let you do that. In fact, if we back up just a bit to verse 21, it's not wives submit to your husbands or husbands give yourself up for your wives, but it's mutual. Verse 21 says submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Context is very important. But I want us just to reflect for a moment here that these commands do make us modern people feel very uncomfortable. Because what the Apostle Paul is really teaching us is that as Christians, when we get married especially, when we're in an intimate relationship, we voluntarily give up our freedom for the sake of another. So that I, as a husband, I don't get to make decisions just for myself, but I must be always thinking about my wife, and if I have kids, my children. As a wife, you always need to be making decisions, thinking about your husband as well, not just for your own sake. And because a Christian relationship entails two people giving up their freedom for the sake of the other, it makes modern people very uncomfortable, because modern people in the West, we don't like to talk about giving up our freedom. But that is a shape of a Christian marriage, where we voluntarily sacrifice for one another so that together we have a stronger relationship, a more Christ-like relationship. But the way to deal with this possibility of abuse is not to back away from the commands and to somehow, imagine a different form of Christian marriage. The way to deal with this is just to recognize that the Apostle Paul and the way to use God's law, we're not meant to use these things as a club to try to control others. If I would look at verse 22 and say to my wife, look, you're supposed to submit to me, and that means you have to do everything I say, that would not be right. That's not a right understanding of the passage. But even worse, that would be me using this passage as a club to try to control my wife, and that's spiritual manipulation. Or if my wife were to look at me and say, verse 25 says you have to give everything up for me, therefore do what I say, that again would not be the right use. That would be spiritual manipulation. The right way to use these passages, and the right way to use the law of God more broadly, is for each of us individually to reflect, so that I can look at verse 25 and I can ask myself, am I sacrificing of myself for the sake of my wife and the sake of my children? Am I sacrificing of myself? Am I being Christ-like toward them? And that's something for me to ask myself, not something for my wife to use to control me. And in the same way, my wife might look at verse 22 and she can ask herself, am I submitting to my husband the way that Jesus calls me to? But again, that's not for me to try to use to control her. That's for her to think about for herself. And verse 25, for me to think about for myself. So that we each use it to reflect upon our own lives, but neither of us uses it to control the other. And this gets even more clear if we keep going in chapter 6, because there the Apostle Paul talks about two more relationships. And these are relationships where there is an expectation of authority and obedience. But even in these relationships, coercion and control is not permitted. So chapter 6, verse 1, he says, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. And in chapter 6, verse 5, he says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. So there is an expectation of authority and obedience here. But even in these relationships, using coercion and control is not permitted. Chapter 6, verse 4 says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. That means don't provoke them, don't mistreat them, don't control them. Instead, the apostle says, bring them up in the training and the instruction of the Lord. Let God's law do its work on their hearts, and don't try to control them because they aren't making the choices that you would make. In the same way, verse 9, masters, treat your slaves the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there's no favoritism with him. So even in a master-slave relationship, you are not permitted to mistreat your slave. What does this mean? It means that no matter our close relationships, We are never permitted to coerce another. We're never permitted to harm another for the sake of controlling their actions. We're never permitted to, to use emotional manipulation. We're never permitted to coerce or to intimidate or to threaten another. Those would not be a Christian form of relationship. Instead, a Christian form of relationship can only come from each of us reflecting upon our own lives in light of God's word and asking, am I doing this the right way? Am I fulfilling my obligations and my duties to my spouse, to my children, to the others around me? And each of us can ask that question of ourselves, but none of us may use those passages to control another. That's the bottom line. So I hope we've seen today that what's going on in abusive relationships is that an abuser believes that they have the right to control another and to enforce their control through all sorts of tactics, but this is not biblical. Instead, what happens in Christian and biblical relationships is that we each ask ourselves, am I living rightly towards the people around me? And we let one another be free. Free to engage in the relationship, free to remain in the relationship, but also free to disconnect, to step back, to protect themselves if we are mistreating them, right? We need to let that person make their own decisions, even if it's not the choice that I would make. That is the only way to treat people in a Christian way. We must let the people around us freely choose their actions. Now, that's it for this video. Our next video, our fourth video, is a little bit of a challenging one. And this is speaking to those people in the fourth video. What if you are the one who is the abuser in a relationship? If you feel like that might be you, check out the next video. See you then.